Wealthy women humiliate Sandra Bullock at Gala until Clint Eastwood steps. And the Gala was in full swing, an event that brought together the city's elite for an evening of opulence and socializing. The guests were draped in luxurious gowns and sharp tuxedos, glasses of champagne clinking in the air as laughter and conversation filled the grand hall. Sandra Bullock, a renowned actress in her own right, walked through the glittering crowd, her eyes scanning the room for familiar faces. Despite the dazzling surroundings, Sandra felt a slight sense of discomfort. She wasn't used to this level of wealth and power, and while she was a guest, there was always a sense of being an outsider among the millionaires and socialites who surrounded her. She tried to push those thoughts aside as she smiled and greeted people along the way. Her confidence was real, but her nerves were bubbling just below the surface. As she made her way towards the bar, a group of wealthy women stood in a circle, their eyes flicking over her with barely concealed judgment. They exchanged whispers and quiet giggles, the kind of ridicule that was all too familiar to anyone who didn't fit their perfect, polished image. Sandra had faced this before, the subtle, cutting remarks that didn't seem all that harmful, on the surface but stung all the same. One of the women, a blonde with an air of superiority, turned to Sandra with a smirk. "I didn't realize you'd be attending this kind of event," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I always thought you were more down to earth. Or perhaps you're just here for the publicity." Another woman snickered quietly, clearly enjoying the discomfort she was causing. Sandra's face remained calm, but she could feel the heat rising in her chest. She knew this was nothing but jealousy and insecurity masked as politeness. But the words still cut. She had been through a lot in her life: public scrutiny, criticism, and the weight of expectation. But that didn't mean she didn't feel the sting of being humiliated in front of such an influential crowd. The women continued to mock her, their voices rising just loud enough for those around them to hear. It wasn't just a simple insult. It was a calculated attempt to undermine her, to make her feel small in a world that was already difficult enough to navigate. Sandra wasn't one to back down easily, but in this moment, surrounded by the elite, and with everyone watching, she felt vulnerable. Sandra's smile tightened, but she refused to let the women see how much their words had affected her. She had been through enough in her career and personal life to let petty gossip shake her. But there was something about being publicly ridiculed by people who had so much power and influence that made her feel small, like she didn't belong. Her heart raced slightly, but she steadied herself, focusing on her breath, willing the discomfort to fade. But as the women's taunts continued, it became clear they weren't done. One of them, a tall woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a diamond necklace that could blind you, stepped closer to Sandra. "I guess you're used to being in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons, huh?" she said, her voice filled with a biting sweetness. "I mean, we're all just trying to have a little fun here, but it's hard to enjoy the evening when someone like you, well, let's just say you don't quite fit in." Sandra's face remained calm, but inside, she was seething. This wasn't fun. It was cruelty wrapped in designer labels. But just as she was about to reply, a strong, gravelly voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" The words were sharp, direct, and unwavering, yet they had an undeniable authority behind them. The group of women froze, turning towards the source of the voice. Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of the group, his tall frame casting a shadow over the women who had been so quick to tear down Sandra. His gaze was steady, cool, and unflinching, but there was an unmistakable air of someone who had dealt with much worse than snide comments from a group of privileged women. One of the women, still holding her glass of champagne, looked Clint over, then smirked. "And what's your business, sir?" she asked, the edge of her sarcasm barely hidden. "This is a private conversation." Clint didn't flinch. His expression remained neutral, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. "It's a private conversation, is it?" he said, his voice low but cutting through the chatter of the gala with ease. "Seems more like an attempt to tear someone down in front of others. That's not private. That's just poor manners." The women were taken aback, clearly not expecting to be confronted like this. Sandra, meanwhile, stood there in stunned silence, surprised that someone, especially Clint Eastwood, had stepped in to defend her. One of the women laughed nervously, trying to regain control of the situation. "We weren't doing anything wrong," she said with an uneasy chuckle, but the doubt in her voice betrayed her attempt to salvage the moment. "We were just having a little fun." Clint's gaze never wavered. Fun doesn't come at the expense of someone's dignity. You should know that, considering the kind of people you are. The silence that followed was thick. The women glanced at each other, clearly caught off guard. The power dynamics in the room had shifted, and now instead of feeling like the ones in control, they were the ones feeling exposed. Sandra could see it in their eyes. This wasn't the usual easy target they could toy with, and Clint Eastwood had made it clear that no one was above a lesson in respect. Clint Eastwood's presence alone was enough to make the women pause. The air had shifted, and the tone of the conversation had completely changed. Sandra stood there, slightly stunned, but a sense of gratitude began to flood her chest. Clint didn't just walk into the scene. He had stepped in with a quiet power that demanded respect, and it was clear that the women could feel it. They were no longer in control of the situation. The tall woman who had been the most vocal seemed to lose some of her arrogance. She gave Clint a forced smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure you didn't mean to cause a scene," she said, her tone now much more careful, trying to brush off the confrontation. "It's just a gala. No harm done." Clint raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "The only harm done is to the person you're bullying," he said, his voice firm but not loud. His words were a simple truth, and there was no denying it. He wasn't interested in apologies or excuses. He wanted them to understand the damage they'd done. Sandra, still processing everything, finally found her voice. "It's okay," she said quietly, her gaze shifting from Clint to the women who had humiliated her just moments ago. "I don't need anyone to defend me." But Clint wasn't about to back down. "It's not about defending you, Sandra," he replied, his tone softening just slightly. "It's about showing people that no one gets to treat others like that. Not here, not anywhere." There was a moment of silence, and Sandra could see the wheels turning in the minds of the women. They weren't used to this kind of direct confrontation, not when they were used to wielding their wealth and status as shields. But Clint wasn't intimidated. He didn't care about their wealth, their status, or their power. All he cared about was doing what was right. One of the other women, who had been quiet up until now, looked down at her drink, avoiding Clint's gaze. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in the dynamic. But the tall woman wasn't ready to back down yet. She tried to regain some ground, her voice tight. "You don't know anything about us. We don't need a lecture from you." Clint chuckled, but it wasn't a light-hearted laugh. It was the kind of laugh that came from someone who had lived through more than most people could imagine. "I don't need to know anything about you. I know enough about respect," he said, his words cutting through the woman's defensive tone. "You think you're above everyone else, but that doesn't mean you get to treat people like they're nothing. You might want to remember that the next time you decide to mock someone for no reason." Sandra felt a weight lift off her shoulders as Clint spoke. It was like a burden she didn't even know she was carrying had been momentarily lifted. His words weren't just for the women. They were for her too. He had just reminded her of something she had forgotten in that moment. She didn't need to be afraid. She didn't need to shrink away from people who thought they were better than her. Clint turned to Sandra, giving her a quick nod, as if to say everything was going to be all right. The women, now visibly embarrassed, exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected to be confronted like this, especially not by someone as formidable as Clint Eastwood. The tall woman took a deep breath, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. "We're leaving," she said, her voice trembling just slightly as she motioned for the others to follow. It wasn't a statement of pride, but of retreat. They knew they had lost, and there was no point in trying to save face anymore. As they walked away, Clint looked back at Sandra, who was still standing there, a mixture of relief and gratitude on her face. She smiled at him, but it wasn't a simple smile. It was a smile that acknowledged the power of what had just happened. She wasn't just a victim of their cruelty anymore. She was someone who had been seen, heard, and respected. Clint, ever. The stoic figure gave her a small nod before turning and walking away, his posture straight as always. Sandra watched him for a moment, her admiration for him growing with each passing second. In that moment, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a legendary actor. He was a man who stood for something much more important: respect, dignity, and the courage to stand up when it mattered most. Clint's steps echoed as he made his way toward the exit, leaving behind the gala and its tense atmosphere. Sandra stood there, still processing everything that had just unfolded. She felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted off her chest. It wasn't just Clint's intervention, it was the understanding that she didn't have to endure humiliation in silence, that standing up for herself was her right, and she wasn't alone in that battle. But as Clint approached the doors, the crowd around him couldn't help but take notice. His reputation was legendary, yes, but it was more than that. It was his calm, unwavering presence in the face of adversity that set him apart. In a world filled with people who used their power to tear others down, Clint Eastwood had proven that real strength came from standing up for others, not letting the bullies win. As Clint reached the door, a woman, one of the guests who had witnessed the scene, rushed up to him. "Mr. Eastwood, I just wanted to thank you for what you did back there," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You didn't just help Sandra, you helped all of us who were watching." Clint paused and turned slightly, his sharp eyes meeting hers. There was a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "It's not about being thanked," he replied in his usual calm tone. "It's about doing what's right." And in that moment, those women needed to know what respect looks like. Sandra, still standing near the bar, watched the interaction from a distance. Her heart swelled with a mix of appreciation and awe. She wasn't used to being the center of attention like this, but she couldn't help but feel empowered by Clint's words. It wasn't just about him stepping in to save her. It was about the lesson he had imparted on the women and on everyone who had witnessed the exchange. One by one, people who had watched the scene unfold began to approach Clint, offering words of admiration and respect. He didn't seek their praise, but there was a quiet recognition in their eyes. Clint had done something that few would have done. He had stood up to those who thought their money and status gave them the right to belittle others. As Sandra walked over to Clint, the room felt different. The air had shifted from tension to respect. The women who had once mocked her were gone, but the effect of their cruelty was still lingering in the room. Clint had erased that, not with violence or anger, but with simple truth and dignity. When Sandra reached Clint, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said softly. Her voice was steady, but the gratitude was clear. "I didn't know I needed someone to step in, but I'm glad you did." Clint gave her a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes we all need a reminder of what's right," he replied. "It's not just about standing up for ourselves, it's about standing up for others too." Sandra nodded, her smile growing. "You're right." There was a quiet strength in Clint's words that seemed to echo in her mind. She had been through so much in her life, from public scrutiny to personal battles, but she had never felt more empowered than she did in that moment. She wasn't just Sandra Bullock, the actress. She was a person who deserved respect just like everyone else. As Clint turned to leave, Sandra called after him. "Clint, wait." He paused and looked back at her, waiting. I want you to know that you've made a difference tonight," she said. "You didn't just defend me. You reminded me what it feels like to stand tall in the face of judgment." Clint gave her a simple nod, the quiet acknowledgement of a man who understood exactly what she meant. "It's all about standing tall, Sandra. Never forget that." With that, he walked out the door, leaving Sandra standing there, her heart full. She hadn't just learned a lesson about respect. She had learned that standing up for yourself wasn't a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. And Clint Eastwood had shown her that strength in the most unexpected way. The night continued on, but the atmosphere had changed. The grand hall, once filled with the murmurs of socialites and the clinking of glasses, now felt more serene. The usual undercurrent of power and status had been replaced with something more profound: respect. The people around Sandra had witnessed something rare that night. It wasn't just about the glittering gowns or the fame that filled the room, it was about the character that stood at the center of it all. And Clint Eastwood had shown them, not just through words, but through actions, the kind of character that left a lasting impression. Sandra stood at the bar for a moment longer, gathering her thoughts. She wasn't going to let the judgment of a few wealthy women define her. Tonight she had been reminded of her own worth, of the power she held when she stood her ground. Clint had given her that. And in that, he had given her something more valuable than any award or recognition. He had given her the courage to walk through life with her head held high, regardless of what others thought of her. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning the people who had witnessed the scene. There were no more whispers or side glances. Instead, there were nods of approval, looks of respect. She realized in that moment that people had been waiting for someone to take a stand. It wasn't about Clint Eastwood's fame. It was about the values he represented, standing up for what's right regardless of the cost. Sandra took a deep breath and walked away from the bar, feeling more at peace than she had in a long time. She didn't need the approval of anyone who didn't understand the importance of treating others with kindness and dignity. She had learned that lesson tonight, and it was one she wouldn't soon forget. As she made her way to the exit, she caught sight of Clint one last time. He was standing by the door, talking to a few guests, his calm demeanor unshaken by the earlier confrontation. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't even looking for gratitude. He was simply being who he was, a man who understood that standing up for others was the right thing to do. His actions spoke louder than any speech ever could, and Sandra knew that this wasn't just a lesson for her, it was a lesson for everyone who had witnessed it. Before she left, she turned to one of the staff members. "Please make sure Clint Eastwood knows how much his actions tonight meant," she said, her voice filled with genuine sincerity. "He reminded me of something important, about standing tall no matter the circumstances." The staff member nodded, clearly understanding the depth of what Sandra was saying. As Sandra stepped out into the cool night air, the weight she had been carrying seemed lighter. The world outside the gala was the same as before, but she felt different, stronger, more confident. Clint Eastwood's words echoed in her mind. It's not just about standing up for yourself. It's about standing up for others too. Tonight, she had seen that in action. She had witnessed firsthand the power of standing up for what's right no matter the odds, and in the process, she had discovered her own strength. Sandra smiled to herself, knowing that no matter where life took her next, she would always remember the lesson she had learned that evening. As she drove home that night, a sense of peace washed over her. She had faced the judgment of others, but she had also found the courage to rise above it. And she knew deep down that she would never let anyone diminish her again. She would always stand tall, just as Clint Eastwood had taught her. Please subscribe to the channel for Clint Eastwood respect. Thanks.